Hi there, welcome to episode 24 of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host Tom Mason, and today is going to kick off the first episode in a new series I'm calling Tom's Sculpting Archives. Now what this is going to be is it's going to be kind of a review of all the miniatures I've sculpted over the years. I started back in 2002, nearly 15 years ago, and I have learned a ton over those years, and I would like to share it with you. I think there's a lot that you'll get out of seeing, how much of an amateur I was when I started, and how I've evolved through the different materials, and why I decided to switch, and just the struggles. And I hope that can be an encouragement to all of you to help you know that you just got to keep sculpting, and you'll get to where you want to be, and you'll make great miniatures. So this first episode will cover the very earliest years of my sculpting career, 2002 and 2003. The Mini Sculpting Super Show is powered in part by Sculptomo Toys. See everything they have to offer at sculptomotoys.com. My foray into miniature sculpting started way back in 2002. As you can see, I did 2 miniatures this year, and this is the very first one I ever sculpted. Basically, right after I found out what green stuff was, bought a pack of it, and started sculpting right away. And I called this guy a goblinoid guy. Nothing too fancy, but in my mind I was making a little goblin. Let's see, he is about 20 millimeters hunched over, taller if he was standing up straight, but I tended to do this proportions a lot with my early guys, as you'll see here, even on this one, which I'll get into in a second. So this was a great learning experience. I used, I think, 24 gauge copper wire, which is good and usable, but it's very flexible. I mean, normally when you get green stuff over the wire, it isn't flexible, but this guy is super flexible. Well, I was super excited when I finished sculpting this guy. I even etched in my name on this really horribly made tab. And so I went out and I bought this little RTV kind of quick get started kit. And I can't remember, it was called, I don't remember what it was called, Quicksil maybe? But what it was is it wasn't a poured resin, so it was a lot easier to use, but not as good as the poured stuff in my opinion. You basically mixed up this 2-part gum putty stuff, and then you smash that together to create the 2 mold halves. So it wasn't liquid at all, but it's the same process. But I tried to mold this guy in metal, and had little to no experience on what it took to mold a miniature. But you can still see lots of the residue, and I made a couple molds just to see if I could do it, and some were okay, some not so good. But I still have this little original guy. Now, everybody I showed this to always said that they thought it seemed more like a frogman than a goblin or whatever. And I think it's because it was my first time sculpting, so there's no nose. So I just left it off. I thought it looked kind of cool, and it made it easier to do. But I remember when I was sculpting this guy that I built. This is kind of how I started sculpting, and I've sculpted a lot with green stuff since, is you put little bits on at a time. I remember doing just the feet, and then just those calves, and then just those legs, the thighs rather, just slowly building it up and putting little balls at a time for these muscles, which is cool because it makes a nice cut look. It makes it very easy to delineate the different muscle forms, but it takes a long time. So pretty happy. The only thing that this haunted me for a while is I did not know or understand how to make tabs. I didn't have brown stuff or anything hard, so what I did is I had extra wire, so I just spread it out between this figure, and then I just smushed on a bunch of putty, tried to get it as close to tab shape as possible, trim it down, which is perfectly fine, but I think the way I do it nowadays is easier, where it's a separate piece that you just drill and pop into place. Alright, this next figure is a dwarf warrior. So I'm a huge fan of dwarves. As you can see, it was the second miniature I ever sculpted. And this guy is about 25 millimeters tall, but as you can see, he's extremely thin and pretty tall. And actually, if you were to just scale this guy up to be, say, 30 millimeters or 35, he'd probably just look like a burly human. But, whoops, in my estimation and what I was trying to do, you know, it looked pretty cool. He's a buff dwarf guy. He's got a big beard, and I was really happy with the progress that I made on this guy. Obviously there's no toes. He does have, and I hid his fingers a bit when I made this fist like that. And this hand, this shows how little I knew about casting, so let's see if I can get that in the camera. As you can see, look how far out forward from the body that sticks. So it was sitting like that, and then he had his axe, I think it was like this way, with the hand on top of it, way far protruding out. So I cut it off. I believe I went and met the Rodmans at Fortress Figures. Right after I had sculpted this guy, I found out about those guys and where they were, and I went to visit them. And they taught me a lot about undercuts. Unfortunately, this guy was already done, so I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll just cut this arm off, which is really kind of a needless multi-part, because with just a little bit different choice on how he was sitting here standing with the axe, I could have easily made this a single part model and not needed any sort of trimming or multi-part to it. But I was early on and I didn't know that, so live and learn. But very pleased with the muscles, and this is kind of a style that I would keep and carry forward for many years. I think I don't really do it as much now. I guess I did it recently on the Cronin barbarian miniature that I did, but it was a deliberate thing. This is just how I sculpted guys and muscles all the time, period, because it's what I knew and what I liked. But neat story about this figure. This wasn't my, these were both test pieces. My first year, I just was happy that I found the material that you were supposed to, in quotes, use to make miniatures, because this is what everybody used and what they knew how to mold. And so I was just making some figures and I was happy. But this guy I ended up selling the rights for this to be produced. I got a small royalty on every sale or whatever. And I can't remember the name of the company. I probably still have the contract around still, but I believe the guy's name was Jason Steele, is the fellow that I licensed this to, and I don't remember what it was for, how much or anything, but I remember getting a couple bucks, and that was exciting. So, but that did come after my very first commission piece, which is coming up right now. Well, I was super excited to come across this miniature. When I decided I was going to start this video series, I knew one of the ones I obviously would be talking about was my very first commission miniature, which was the Seahorse Dragon for Fantasy West. But I had no idea where the sculpt was. And I started recording and for some of the other miniatures, and then I got super lucky. I was just sorting through stuff and I came across my original sculpt. I thought it had been lost or never returned, but I was super excited to see that it was here, because there's a lot of things to talk about with this. You know, I had only done 2 miniatures before this for myself, and then I was on the One List Sculpting group and answered a call for sculptors to a guy named Troy Megley, super cool guy out in California, and he was doing this line of dragons. So he had a Seahorse dragon, he had a couple other ones. I actually think he showed me one of the images of the other one. That was actually getting sculpted by Sandra Garrity. So I was super honored to be included in this, especially since this was my first real gig. Okay, well, as you can see, this is a pretty large miniature. Oh, where's my ruler? Here it is. Alright, so this guy is about, it's over 90 millimeters tall up to the top of that little ridge there. So very large piece. It's supposed to be a dragon, so that makes sense. And there's a lot to it. Probably too much to it for me at my skill level, but I was excited to try, and I was just thrilled to have a professional gig. So a couple things I want to point out with this that was interesting is that I made it was a lot of pieces, so you're going to see a lot more pieces here than I originally sculpted with. So I'm going to wipe some away. This was technically the original sculpt, so you had 2 kind of wing fins, 2 head fins attached like here. I think this might be the wrong one, and you can see how they don't really blend in. It's just kind of bulbously there. And then these ones they go down here, and they stuck out there. Well, I also had a base, which I'll get into in a minute, and this tail, for whatever reason, I cut it off and made a separate piece, because as you see, I had learned a little bit about mold planes, and for some reason I thought that it curling this way meant that I needed to make this a separate piece. So that was silly. But the reason you see different colorations on the putty here is because this was cast. Fantasy West actually made a casting of this, a master, which, again, I have a copy of that, but I have no idea where it is, packed away somewhere. But when I got the green back, I can't remember if he requested about possibly refining this, or if I just was taking it upon myself to do it, because you see how that's just kind of like bumped up there. It looks like a completely separate piece. It doesn't flow into the model at all. And that's exactly how these wings were. Well, you can see how I went back and I started to work it in to blend it. It's still not really pretty, but it's way better than it was the first time around. So I was just going back and refining some things. Another thing was with this base. There was a really long base, and I was trying to make it look like a typical Reaper cauliflower base, which is the official term for that. But like I said, I did, as I mentioned before in some of my other videos, I didn't know about plastic card and that you can't vulcanize it because of the extreme heat. You can see here it makes it expand, bubble up, and it actually kind of, I think the base did end up working for the most part, but it did warp it. It made it bulge out more than it needed to. Plus, you see how thick this thing was. It was crazy thick, so very expensive, and it was very large. I think it was probably that wide at least. So I ended up refining these bases. Troy asked for something that kind of mimicked the waviness of this back fin, and I hollowed that out. I also had this other one. This might actually not have been for this piece, but it was with it, so I'm thinking it was. It's a long time ago though. And then here I decided, after I made these, I was just going back and I was trying to make a completely new fin, just a much longer wing. I think it fit the piece a lot more. Just kind of gave a little more balance to it, made it a little more dragon-like. But this was a great piece. Troy was infinitely patient with me as I learned. I got to do some neat techniques that I actually haven't done so much before, like this texture to the skin. This was done with sandpaper. I just put on the putty and touched it with sandpaper, and then I cut in some scales afterwards, because I was like, well, it's a seahorse, so it's a fish, so it's going to have some scales, and it's a dragon. Kind of wish I didn't do that, because it's very cartoony, and I don't really think it adds anything. It really detracts, actually, because it's kind of very patterned. It's not like there's a big clump and then it tears off like you see with drawings from time to time. But very first commission piece, a very large piece at that. And so, yeah, I still look back on this, and I'm actually really impressed with what I was able to accomplish with the knowledge and skill level that I had. Next up is my second professional sculpting commission, and this is for a company called FG Minis. This guy, his name is Topher the Dwarf, and he's just a dwarf fighter warrior. This is a 54 millimeter miniature. Again, for whatever reason, when I very first started out, all the jobs were for larger figures. I don't know. There just seemed to be several people doing that at the time, and they were new and I was new, so it just all worked out perfectly in order to, we were both willing to give each other a chance. I do want to say this, though, about this figure. Well, not this figure, more about how I got this job. So FG Minis was the name of the line. It's from awesome guy named Mark Krakow. He owns fantasy games up in South Bend, and he wanted to do a little miniatures line. He always wanted to have some miniatures. And so he told me that the number one reason he decided to hire me to do this job is because of how thoughtful and clear my email response to his job posting was. I used good grammar, complete sentences, and gave well thought out and filled information. So, and I bring this up because there's a lot of times, as I've worked with other people back when I was at MegaCon Games, hiring sculptors and painters and other artists, I was really surprised at the number of people that would cold call or cold email me and give little to no information. Not just pricing, but like they didn't even seem to understand what was needed for the project or what our company was looking for. They basically expected me to do all the work, even though they were soliciting me for work. So I just wanted to point that out and say, do your research and be respectful and thoughtful in your emails. So, anyways, Topher the Dwarf. This, I'm going to say this a lot, but all these early figures were really a big learning experience. As you can probably see in the picture, his axe head is white, and that's because I use plastic card, which right nowadays isn't a big deal because everybody will either cast stuff in resin if they need to, mold in silicone rubber and then cast in resin to get masters, or use the low temp silicone vulcanization process, which also can typically is okay for plastic card. But back in the day, those were not used as much. The RTV silicone molding was around, but it was more expensive, and the low temp rubbers weren't being used yet or weren't around. So now I'm pretty sure Fortress Figures were the ones. I don't remember if they were the ones that molded this. No, it was either them or Jeff Valent. Either way, no, it was Jeff Valent. I think he actually re-sculpted that axe head for me when I sent this piece in. And super, super gracious of him, Jeff Valent of Jeff Valent Studios. But I think I made the base had a big hunk of plastic card in it too, so it ended up bubbling and warping a bit and had to be reworked. So, but they're very gracious and got it working for me. But this figure was a lot of fun. Was never that happy with the face. I felt like it was a little too flat, and part of that was just working so large with green stuff. I've said this before in my other videos. I've never felt super comfortable with sculpting in green stuff, even though I've gotten a lot better at it. But back then it was a real struggle, and just ended up doing a big beard with all that hair and whatnot. It was a challenge, but all in all, I liked the guy. I liked doing the scale mail kind of undergarb, under armor, and But one big thing that was cool about this figure and the next couple ones that I'm going to talk about was I got to concept all of them too. So, I went to school for illustration and graphic design, and so it was a lot of fun to be able to draw the concept for this character and try and bring it to life. And I feel, again, that the best part of this miniature is how I was able to capture the form and the pose that I concepted. After finishing Topher, I pretty quickly started on another character named Kayla the Barbarian. And this, goes back to everything that I was about. Barbarians, Conan. This is probably one of my favorite guys to sculpt for the line, even though I think, anyways, I really like doing this guy, basically because this is essentially like the D&D character I would always want to sculpt. Again, got to do the concept. It was a lot of fun there, developing the ideas and then thinking about armor and just different things here. Had to cut his arm off, make that a separate piece, and the axe broke off here, but the mold all turned out properly and everything. So I just really like this guy, and I remember staying up so late to get this done. I remember I was working at the time. I was working at a little coffee shop bookstore called Tree of Life, and I remember being at work on probably staying there till close, and I was already so tired because I had, stayed up too late the night before working on this thing, probably playing a game, and then knowing that I had to stay up the rest of that night to finish him, to go deliver him to Mark up in South Bend in the morning, which was just insane. So, but yeah, I love this miniature. I made a couple extra accessories for him here. I made this large sword that could go on his back, like an extra piece of equipment, because he loses his axe, he can draw this great sword. And I had a shield. I think it was all designed to go together. You would just kind of glue it on there yourself. But as you can see, I don't know if you can tell this, these two were never molded. See how bright the green stuff is? Can't really tell with the brown. It doesn't shift color too much. But these were never molded, but I did them anyways. It was fun. So I have them, and that was cool. That's exciting. But yeah, I'm pretty OCD about keeping these things. I actually have them all cataloged. I made a custom container to hold everything. It's got several different cells in them to hold rows of clamshells, and each clamshell is labeled appropriately who I sculpted it for, when, and what miniature it is. And I even keep all these little bits, parts of belts and stuff that break off the figure just in case. You never know if you need it again. No, I'm kind of joking about that because obviously I know I don't, but back then I was very obsessed with that sort of thing, just keeping and cataloging it all. So, but yeah, I really enjoyed this guy. I was trying some new techniques. I'm not sure if you can tell. So at the time, I know I never really talk about this, but there were really two putties that people sculpted with. There was green stuff, you can see it better on the shield, and then Polymeric Systems Inc. also made a material called brown stuff, which is basically you would use this the same way that I use Aves and the green stuff mix. This stuff you mix up all by itself. It kind of feels a lot like green stuff, but it's a little tougher, or less gummy, I should say. But it's definitely a putty, not very loose like Aves. But it cures rock hard, and you can file it. And a lot of people would mix green stuff with this stuff to kind of, again, do what I do a lot of times to get a little bit of both, the best of both worlds. So, but one of the things that I had done was, I believe, this has been 2003. I believe I had been to Gen Con at this point, and had been at the first sculptors meeting, met Bobby Jackson, Sandra Garrity, Gene Van Horn, and one of the things that I had seen and heard is that a lot of people would do faces with brown stuff. I don't know why. Some people just like to do it, so I thought it was a thing, so I figured I'd try it. So tried sculpting this guy's face with brown stuff. I think it worked pretty good, but again, I got a little bit flatness on the face, and this eye's a little bulgy, although I guess you could say it's because he's got a scar, so maybe his face is messed up. But all in all, great learning experience. This hand, a little bit of a meat paw thing, but yeah, it was a lot of fun to do and very tiring because I did not plan as best I could to get it done. Lesson learned. The last figure of 2003 is Nazdrew the Sorcerer. This is another 54mm sculpt for FG Minis, as was Kalar. I think I call him Kalar, but I'm pretty sure I used to pronounce it Kalar. Anyways, but this is Nazdrew the Sorcerer. And I had a lot of fun. Again, did a concept of this guy too. Every single one of these that I did for FG Minis, I got to do the concept, which was really fun. I'm not sure I did it much ever since, except for when I started doing my own stuff finally. But this was a neat sculpt because I had to do some new things. I had to figure out how to make a book. I had made some weapons before, had more practice, but for some reason this was really challenging to me, and as you can see, it's very uneven. I mean, I guess I kind of got away with it a little bit because it's a ratty old sorcerer's book, but it's definitely rough, and it was supposed to attach like right here, and you can probably tell why it ripped off because there's protrudes up into the mold a decent amount and has some undercuts. So that popped off. And here we go. This is one of tab. I think originally the figures were supposed to be mounted on their own custom sculpted bases, but we went to these tabs, and this is just I can't remember if I mixed. I think this is purely, this is green stuff with some extra blue, and just see how flexible it is. And I etched in FG Minis, TJM, so you know who did it. But, oof, really flimsy, junky thing. But yeah, I really like the form that I had on this guy. Again, I did a brown stuff face, still pretty flat. I was trying to figure out hair. Hair was very tough for me in the early days because I like to... one of my biggest inspirations was Joe Madureira, and I loved those kind of like thick locks of hair, just these big shapes. And I tried to do that early on, but I was also very torn by the idea that, it's a miniature, you gotta have the details, so you gotta put in all the individual strands, and just cutting in all those little details was a little challenging. Some of the parts are a little grimy and rough looking, but then there's other parts like the back that I think looks really nice. Also had a couple more spikes here. It looks like they popped off. And then chains, man, chains are tough. So I was working on that pretty early on as well. Man, as good as these figures are, they taught me a lot, but it was tough sculpting 54mm miniatures and green stuff. I don't think it would be so bad nowadays for me, but back then I like I said, I worked in such small little batches at a time, and doing these large broad cloth parts, it took forever. And I wasn't comfortable enough to sculpt a little bit and then start sculpting another area and another area. Like, I would do my little part and then I would put it in the putty oven and wait. And I usually didn't have more than one sculpture going at a time, because back then, still now a little bit, I like to focus on one thing at a time. But when you're sculpting with putty, you need to have 2 or 3 miniatures going so you can bounce back and forth. If you need to set it aside to let it cure. If you're comfortable with just working nonstop, then you stick on this one and you're fine. But if you need to give it a rest, then you need to have a couple going at once so you can go back and forth and make progress. Well, I hope you got a kick out of seeing some of my earliest sculptures and just how rough they were, I guess, for lack of a better term. You guys can do it too. Just get started, sculpt your butt off, or even not, because frankly, the amount of sculptures I did in my early years was pretty low, but as long as you keep doing it, you will get there. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all my patrons for helping make this show possible with their generous support. If you'd like to help support the show, just head on over to Patreon and you can be a part of the community as well. Or subscribe to the channel, leave a like, comment below, and I'll be happy to read them all and get back to you. But, as always, make sure you keep sculpting.